And then my research in it, my research doing it again confirmed that. So I'm going to do the best I can here. A lot going on. Okay. So did you know that the stomach is smarter than the brain? Yeah. Yeah. Because it's smarter than the brain, because the stomach warns you when it's empty, but the brain does not. Sorry, I had to do that. Okay.
Brain doesn't warn you when it's empty.
That's right. The stomach tells you when it's empty, but the brain does not.
No.
Anyway, I thought it was funny. So,
But the stomach gives, the signal to the brain that the stomach is empty.
yeah, but the brain doesn't tell you when it's empty.
Yeah, but that's a start when we feel empty.
So how do you know?
We
your
get the
brain-
brain.
You guys,
Yeah.
you're we're moving on.
Oh.
Okay, so today we're talking about a little bit of everything about the brain. Again, getting into too much depth, I'm not going to probably. Hopefully it'll be enough to give you a basic overview and remind you, because I know all of you have been through this, but it will hopefully spur your memory and to think about different things with your brain, okay? So let's start off with what the brain is. It's kind of a command center, right? It controls everything that we do, everything that it gives us the qualities and the characteristics that make us who and what we are. It's the main part of our central nervous system, or CNS. It weighs about 3 pounds. Believe it or not, the different things that make it up, most of it's fat, which I think is interesting. Gives new meaning to the word fathead. So the main parts of the brain we're going to talk about are the skull and the cranium, the meninges, the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex, the hemispheres of the brain, the lobes of the brain, the cerebellum, brainstem, ventricles, and go into a little bit into the circulation and the brain cells. And you know what? I'm thinking that this is not my most recent copy of this.
Okay.
No, it's okay. It's just what it is. I'm just going to have to go with it, I think. Oh, and that just makes me sad. Okay. Well, anyway, the brain's encased in the skull, and the skull is the cranium and all the facial bones as well. So there's, if you include parts of the ear, there's 29 bones. But otherwise there's 22 bones that make up the skull. As far as the cranium goes, there's only 8 bones. And then the brain rests in the cranial cavity. Oops. Yeah, this is not my, I thought I, really?
Yeah, or I can.
Let me, bear with me just a moment, guys.
So your USB is still connected. So which
Okay.
one would it be? This is your USB right here, right?
It's this one. It's the one I emailed to myself here. Can I email it to you?
You can.
Or
email
is there
it.
2 on there?
There's only one.
Okay, and that's the one we are looking at, right?
You can
Okay.
email it to Linda and I'll pull it up.
Okay,
So
bear with me a minute. Let me go through a couple more slides on here just to make sure, but I don't think so. Oh,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah, you can. come back on.
Oh, maybe it is.
Well, they're looking for more money.
Yeah, I think it might be. So let's
Some people
I
have
can
to
always
work,
edit it out.
but some
to the
people.
video, so good.
that's okay. Okay, we're gonna go on. I'm sorry for the hold up here. I just wanted to make sure that I had what I thought I had. So,
Progress.
okay, so
So are you sure? it's good? And then
Sorry about that.
You're good.
Okay, great. So, you know, the brain interprets all of our senses. It's responsible for all of our movements, our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, breathing, heart rate, hormones, vision, blood pressure regulation, all the workings of our organs. I just got ahead of myself here. Okay, so let's start with the meninges. Can you guys see that slide? Okay, the meninges. Okay, great. Because I thought it was actually a pretty good one. Oh yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So the meninges are the three layers of, there are three membranes that cover our brain. So you have, like on here, you have your scalp and your skull. And then you have the dura mater, which actually means hard mother. So you have two of the dura mater. You have your periosteal, which is right here. Periosteal means
There's something else I can.
it's attached to, it's part of the bone, kind of. It's attached to the skull. Okay. Then you have your meningeal layer. And there is a little bit of space in there. We'll talk about the spaces. So you have your meningeal, the dura mater here. And there's a space in between here, the arachnoid space. So the arachnoid space, so all of these together, they protect the brain, they support the brain, the blood vessels. They provide a continuous space for cerebrospinal fluid to kind of bathe the brain, take care of it, be a cushion for it, and take waste away. I wanted to go back here for they are attached to some degree. Like in the subarachnoid space here, you have the arachnoid mater right here. And there's these like web-like projections that go down and attach it to the pia mater, which is like shrink wrap. Shrink wrap, the pia mater is like shrink wrap around the brain and the spinal cord. And again, it helps to keep everything stiff, like the spinal cord. It gives it protection. Yeah, pretty much said everything there. So the spaces in between, you have an epidural space. The epidural space, it does have cerebrospinal fluid that goes through it. There's fat, blood vessels, lymph, and nerve roots. And that one is, the space is between the parietal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater. Okay, kind of floats in there. The epidural space, epi means above, so that's kind of above that dura there. You can put medications in there. You can, infections can occur in there. Bleeding can be in there too. You can have blood clots in there. It's called an epidural hematoma or an epidural bleed if that's what's going on there. And again, having the space there creates another layer of protection for the brain. Then you have your subdural space, which is really not a space at all. It shows like there is one here, the subdural space, like right in here. It's not really a space. It's what they call a potential space. And what that means is if there's a brain injury and there's bleeding, it actually can open up in there to get to attract the blood in there. They often can do procedures. They'll open you up, put a little needle in there and drain blood from there, take blood clots out, things like that, but it's not typically a space. Then you have your subarachnoid, and the sub means below, just like the subdural is just below it. Excuse me. There's blood vessels in there and cerebrospinal fluid, which again, if you think about it, there's 3 spaces and then there's 3 meningeal layers that really create a cushion for the brain. You can have infections in there as well. Let me go back to that a little bit. So you can have infections, brain damage, or brain injuries causing bleeding in there. The infections usually are like meningitis is probably the main one that you've all heard about, which is an inflammation or infection of the meninges, any of those layers and between the layers. There's bacterial meningitis and there's viral meningitis. Bacterial can cause death if it's not treated quickly. The viral generally does not kill people, but it'll make you want to die because it's terrible. Headaches, blurred vision, sometimes rash, flu-like symptoms, a lot of body aches, fever, chills.
Do you get rid of it?
How do you get rid of it? Well, the bacterial they usually use, I think, Cipro for it, but it's a bacteria, so you need antibiotics.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Nausea, vomiting, malaise, poor appetite, changes in mentation can occur. It's generally not as severe with the viral, and the viral gets better on its own. Generally, there's not much they do for that except maybe fluid support. If you're having nausea and vomiting, they will give you IV hydration. You can take medications for discomfort otherwise and nausea.
I know that when my kids were in college, they had a
Vaccine,
vaccine for it because you're really new.
right. And that's how it's transmitted actually, is close contact. You don't have to be like in a room like this when if we're far apart, it's not as big of a deal, but they probably would treat people, say one person came up with it, they probably would give everybody at least 1 dose of Cipro. Depends on your conditions that you have. Your doctor may do something different or give you more, but it's pretty dangerous. As an adult, we don't get it as much. I don't really know why. Maybe it's but we're in close contact. But for kids, they're always sharing drinks and utensils and food and, really close contact. Make sure I didn't miss anything here. On the bacterial aspect of it, again, it needs to be treated pretty quickly. High fevers can cause some brain damage if you don't, if you're lucky enough to live through it. And a lot of people do, and they're treated. But if you don't catch it in time, it can be deadly. The cerebral cortex. So I like this. Cortex means bark. It's made up of these wrinkles that you see up here. And it's about the thickness of 2 to 3 dimes. And again, it's a protective measure. The top of the wrinkles are called gyri or gyrus for single. And the lower portions of them, like over here, are called sulcus or sulci for plural. So this covers all the lobes of the brain. This is the cerebellum, so it doesn't quite cover that, but it covers the whole brain as a protection. And that's actually where most of the processing occurs. I said, I'm trying to stop doing that. The gray matter is gray because of the nerves in those areas lack the insulation to make it white. I don't know that there's much of a difference actually between the job that they do, but in the spinal cord, it's completely opposite. Actually, the outer portion is white and the internal part of the spinal cord is gray. The wrinkles increase the surface area of the brain. That's their purpose. So it increases processing abilities. Now the brain's also split into halves. And this one, I don't know if you can see this. It's not a great picture and I apologize for that. So it's split into two halves or hemispheres. And while they look very much alike, they are very different. And then in some ways they're very much alike. So the left part of the brain covers the sensory stimulus, motor control, speech, language and comprehension, analysis, time, word recognition. And then the right side does the sensory stimulus also from the left side of the body, motor control from the left side of the body, creativity, spatial ability, context, perception, recognition of faces, places, and objects. They don't understand why they crisscross. They know that they do. They're connected by the corpus callosum, which is this C-shaped looking organ, or bunch of nerves is really what it is. It's just a bunch of white matter nerves. But everything goes through to the other side, and they don't really understand that. And I don't have any reason to believe that. I mean, we know that that happens. And they communicate with each other through it as well. There's a theory that people could be left-brained or right-brained. There's been some studies done. I know there was one in 2013, and there's been a few others that kind of disprove that. They did neuroimaging of the brain, and really concluded that there wasn't enough evidence. It sounded kind of like maybe they left it open a little bit, but by and large, we all process the information, and you specifically may have strength in one area where someone else has it in another area, but there really isn't anything to substantiate that, to say someone's left-brained or right-brained. Injury to the corpus callosum can really be terrible, actually. If you have a head injury and there's damage to that, there's going to be no communication between the right and left brain. So the muscles in the face, the signals just don't pass through. One cool thing, though, is that I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read this. Sometimes they'll, let me see. So your muscles, if the messages aren't getting through, you're not going to get the right facial muscles, you're not going to get the right motions. Someone may have some funny facial looks because they're not getting the right signals to the right place. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So now to make it more complicated, you have the cerebral cortex, but it's divided into 4 lobes. And actually it's more than that, because each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. And we're going to talk about the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay, so on the frontal lobe, you have personality characteristics, expressive language, decision-making, I think impulse control, recognition of smell, voluntary muscle movement, motor skills, problem solving, and memory storage. It's responsible for reasoning, logic, judgment, creativity, understanding of social norms. It helps you decide when you should say something and when you should maybe keep quiet. things for picking up things, processing, learning, new info for later use. It helps you retrieve that as well. It also helps you in the processing, keep something in your brain when you're looking at other, like you're looking for plane flights somewhere. You can keep this one in your brain while you're actually looking for others also. Yeah.
On the filtering part, you
Mhm.
say that you shouldn't say. Is that the brain or is that just the way you, more your personality? Or,
That probably plays into it to some degree, because we all have different experiences and personality traits. So I think that it's still true that it's the brain, but then you make the decision whether you're going to say it anyway or whether you're going to just keep it to yourself.
so then you control your filter in some way then?
Sometimes, some people do, but I think we all can. I mean, that's part of the social norms, you know, in certain areas, like you're not gonna scream in church, you know, because you kind of know better, but you may have to process that, or the feeling that you really want to do that, but it's still being processed in your brain, and then whether you decide to do that or not.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that helped. So damage to this part of the brain kind of goes against, I mean, everything that we saw here. So personality changes in social skills, paying attention, organizing and planning, sexual habits, self-control, and speech can be affected. There is a story of Phineas Gage. It was in 1948. He was a 25-year-old man working as preparing a railroad bed in Vermont, and he was working with the explosive part of creating the railroad. So he was using a tamping rod to pack explosive powder into a hole, and the powder exploded. So it went through his cheek and into his brain, and then out his brain. And mind you, this rod was 43 inches long and 1.125 inches wide. So it goes through his face, through his brain, and out. Now, there are some stories that say the result wasn't as bad. This guy lived, and he was actually able to talk, and he could remember people that he was working with. But the story goes that afterwards, he was never really the same. This guy was a good worker. He was like the foreman. So he planned everything. He knew what he was doing. He managed people, you know, and all of that. Afterwards, he was no longer able to do that. He would swear. He was belligerent. And he actually couldn't process what he needed to process to do his job any longer. So in 1994, researchers used neuroimaging techniques to reconstruct the image of his brain. And they said that he would have suffered injury actually to both sides of his frontal lobe, and that it would have created a problem with emotional processing and rational decisions. So one of the stories was that, oh, it wasn't really that bad, but then other people said he was just never really the same. And what I thought was interesting also was in 2022, there was a modern day Phineas Gage. Researchers found that so this happened again, a similar accident happened again. But researchers found that the brain's selective recruitment was able to selectively recruit other areas of the brain that were not injured to help complete actions previously assigned to the injured portion of the brain. So our brain is just so complex. It's so fascinating that it could actually do that. So, and I like this picture here of the rod going through his brain. You can kind of see that. So you have the frontal lobe, but again, let me see, let me go back to. So you have this frontal lobe here, but remember it's on both sides of the brain. So while it actually does the same work, it also does a few things that are a little bit different. And they all rely on each other to get the messages through. So here we have the parietal lobe. It's basically in the center right here behind the frontal lobe. And that processes sensory information, touch, pain, pressure. Messages through there, you can identify objects of their size and shape and location. I think what I like about this was there's a test you can do, and I don't know if you guys in kinesiology know about it's called the 2-point discrimination test, where you can take a paper clip and kind of straighten it out so there's 2 points, or you can use calipers. And you can use an area of the body, whether it's the finger, the arm, the tongue, wherever, and you poke 1 or 2 times. Now, the person that the subject, you close they have their eyes closed. If their parietal lobe is working correctly, they will be able to tell you whether you're poking them just once or twice. Once or twice. Because that is processed through the parietal lobe. Another thing about the parietal lobe is proprioception, where things are in space, where your body is in space. You can use your hand, close your eyes, and you can bring it up, and you kind of know where it is in space here so that you don't hit yourself. And that's part of the parietal lobe with the proprioception. And I say CJ over here, see him over here going, yeah. So the parietal lobe does a lot of sensory integration. It helps you learn from complex movements like reading and writing and math. Those things get easier as you do them. When you enjoy a good meal, it also helps you process the tastes, the smells, and the textures of your food. If this portion of the brain is damaged, you'll have difficulty discriminating between sensory information. You will have difficulty feeling, things like hot and cold. You may not recognize, a cold versus a smooth or a hot and rough texture of something. Spatial awareness problems, you may end up hitting yourself. Depending on how much and where in the parietal lobe the damage is, you may have a thing called, I thought this was really interesting. What's it called? It's a neglection of one part of your, like, for instance, anything on, say, the left side, you have damage to the right parietal lobe, you may not realize that I may not realize this is my left arm, and I'll completely ignore it. It doesn't, if someone's talking to me from the left side, I may not even recognize that or talk to them, respond to them, because I don't get anything over here. And again, the spatial awareness problems, length and depth of things. So you could injure yourself pretty good if you don't recognize what's going on one side of your body or the other. You'll have difficulty with math, reading and writing and drawing, but it won't affect your ability to talk and understand speech. Planning and organizing. So planning that trip is going to be a problem. So the temporal lobe, which is on the side of your head near your ear, kind of right above it a little bit, but in front of the occipital lobe, which is the back part here. This integrates information from the senses, sight and sound, facial recognition, and known objects. The role in recognition and use of words to communicate, processing of emotions, housing structures of the limbic system, olfactories, and the amygdala and hippocampus, which we'll talk about those in a little bit too. the temporal lobe helps us to connect to our environment. It helps us to understand things that come through. It's processed through the temporal lobe. You process sounds like when you hear something, like when you hear a siren or you hear someone laughing, you think, oh, I heard someone laughing. But to be honest, it goes through your ears and then it has to go to your brain and it goes to the temporal lobe. And then it tells you, oh, that's laughing or that's a siren.
So we really hear it to our brain.
Pardon?
We really hear it to our brain, not our.
Well, that the brain is what tells you what it is. You'll hear it through your ears and it kind of goes to your occipital lobe. And then I think what I hear it goes to, then it's processed. What you're hearing goes to the temporal lobe and that will tell you what it is that you're hearing. It's just kind of like a vision thing. And we were talking about this earlier, like I see my water jug here and I think that I'm just seeing it. But it's my brain in the occipital lobe where the vision is, and then it's processed to tell me that this is a water jug. But we don't think about all the bouncing around in our brain that this has to, that occurs to make sense of what I'm seeing or hearing in this case. You know, a baby laughing, a siren, keys jingling. Again, you hear those things, but it has to be processed in your brain. And then that tells you what it is that you're actually hearing. The temporal lobe helps us with emotions as well, which it's fascinating that the brain, a lot of these areas of the body help us process little bits of almost everything. There's major portions, like the temporal lobe has a main, maybe a main thing that it does, but it utilizes information from other parts of the brain to tell you, to complete the understanding of what it is that you're doing or you're thinking or you're saying or hearing or feeling. Emotions help us with learning as well in the temporal lobe. Positive emotions like happiness and pleasure from rewards and good outcomes, and then emotions like sadness and disappointment, you know, from consequences and unwanted outcomes. We learn those things for helping us in the future to understand what's going on. Damage to the temporal lobe can cause us memory problems, changes in understanding, ability to move your face, parts of your arm, face, and leg, difficulty with math or using numbers, emotional problems, confusion, seizures, vision issues. And again, a lot of different parts of the brain are involved with the damage and may be able to access other parts of the brain to help make up for the damage in that particular temporal lobe area. The other thing I wanted to mention actually with the temporal lobe, if you have damage to it, is emotional issues, I mentioned, but dementia, other kinds of memory issues, seizures, schizophrenia, speaking and writing would be impacted. And depending on which side the damage is, a lot of that would occur on the other side of your body. The occipital lobe, located in the back, as you can see, that one decodes messages sent by your eyes and turns it into information your brain can use, which I think is what we were kind of talking about too. When you hear things, it, you know, it decodes it and then it sends it there so that to your other parts of your brain so it can tell you what it is. Light and images come through your eyes, it hits the retina, then it goes, it creates messages that are travel along the optic nerve and the optic tracts of your brain. And along those tracks, the thalamus relays coded signals until they reach your occipital lobe. And then it can tell you what it is that you actually saw. I think that's interesting. And we talked about that. So again, it works cooperatively with other parts of the brain so that you can see and understand what it is you're actually seeing, or it tells you what you're actually seeing. Facial recognition is a big thing that the occipital lobe helps with as well. The distance and size of objects. So damage to your occipital lobe would cause some visual issues. What's interesting, I think, is you can have like word blindness, and I think I wrote that. It's called alexia. And what it means is so you still might be able to see. You'll see, like writing on my notes here, I could look at that, but all my brain would tell me is there's lines and symbols there. I wouldn't know what it says, basically. I could see it, but it doesn't process the information properly. Motion blindness is, achinotopsia. I'd never heard that word before. That causes to not see motion in your visual field. So you could still see things, but you wouldn't see over here. And then again, it depends on which side of the occipital lobe the damage was done. So you may only have it on one side.
Would this be the same part of the brain? I don't know if you've ever been like in a train, passenger train, where like you're looking out. And this, like you're stopped, both two trains are stopped side by side, and then one takes off, but you don't know if it's yours or the other one, or is that like breaking the brain? I mean, I know it's not a damage, but
I was just going to say it's not damage, but it may play a part in
is it the same part?
trying to understand, well, like motion sickness, right? Because all of these things are going by, and it has to do with the inner ear though. And I think it mixes up the signals. Is that about right? Do you know? Yeah. If you know, yeah. Uh-huh.
They're mixing up, like, I'm supposed to be moving, but I'm not moving. And that's
Right.
what I'm saying.
Well, and I think that kind of goes along with what you're saying, where you're in a train and there's one next to you and it starts to move and you feel like you're moving. Right. So I think what happens is you get mixed signals. And it may have something to do with the vagus nerve too, that could kind of go down into the, by the stomach and maybe cause some nausea or whatever, that like motion sick. Does that help make sense of that?
I was just
Kind
thinking
of.
if it just tricks the, or not confuses the brain, because you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're just starting to move, not when you've been moving, because you can feel the.
Uh-huh.
the
Right.
over Here,
Right.
but like, when you know, like, oh, are we finally leaving, or is it the other, because, you know, you have to look on the other side and go. oh,
Right.
It's them, or.
Or when you're at a stoplight and another lane starts to go and you're like, oh my God, oh, I'm on the brake. It's okay. I'm not moving. But you feel like maybe you were, Yeah, I think it tricks the brain into a couple of different things for sure. I don't really want to try to pronounce this name, simultanagnosia. This was kind of cool, where it makes it impossible to see more than one object at a time. So if you look at a plate, or if you have damage to the occipital lobe, all you might see is the fork. You won't see, or if you look at a house, say you're driving by, you're looking at homes, but all you would see is the door. You wouldn't see the rest of the house. It's not all that common that happens, but it's pretty interesting that the brain does those things. Yes.
Now, yeah, I've been several times with my ophthalmology,
Ophthalmology, uh-huh.
and examine my eyes. And the examination of the eyes, one of those is look at those glasses through and to tell the ophthalmologist of the, well, the moving circle, I mean, that is, is that the brain doing that or is the eyes?
I think it's the eyes. It sounds like it would be the eyes doing that. The brain is going to process that information, but I'm not really sure how it would be expressed to you, to be honest. But you see it, and I could see that it would go to the occipital lobe. But I don't know how, but I don't think that you have damage in your occipital lobe.
Well,
You would be seeing a neurologist for that, probably.
never.
Yeah,
Never have done, I've been, with my ophthalmologist, but, it's that, it's, the moving light.
Right.
So
Right,
see to your left, see to your right, or up,
sure.
and you follow it. So my question is that the eyes doing it, or is the brain telling you to do it?
But it sounds like to me that the eyes are doing that. If you're seeing the ophthalmologist, he's probably a better person to answer that question, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, well, when the occipital lobe is damaged also, you don't always lose sight, but you sometimes again can see, but that part of your brain cannot tell you what is going on. So very interesting on the occipital lobe. But I do think that's an interesting question. I just don't know the answer to it entirely, but I still think it's the eyes doing that rather than,
When I see it's fun.
yeah,
Ask her about that.
good question.
Yeah, because you should know better than me.
Right, right. Oh, and she will know, she'll know. So the cerebellum is below the occipital. It's right behind the brainstem and right below the occipital lobe. The cerebellum, it means little brain, and it's pretty well protected. By and large, it's not damaged during injury because of it's being well protected. It can be injured, depends on how bad your brain is injured or crushed or whatever. It plays a role in virtually all our physical movement, all voluntary movements. It coordinates them, like walking, tapping your feet to music, dancing. It actually coordinates those movements. Can you imagine if it were damaged, the mess that would cause? You wouldn't have the coordination to actually be able to walk. You'd have the physical ability to do it, but your brain would not coordinate that well. So it would make it very difficult for you to do that. There's new research because they believe now that the cerebellum may play a role in hang on a second here. This is my old thing here. Neurodegenerative diseases like MS, HIV, Lyme disease. Those things can cause damage to the cerebellum, I'm sorry. Lack of oxygen, neurodegenerative diseases, infections such as chickenpox, HIV, Lyme's disease, overuse or abuse of alcohol, stroke, tumor genetic disorders, and trauma. Some of these can actually improve over time though, and with treatment. But what I wanted to say was new research on the roles of the cerebellum in autism, I think, and it was schizophrenia, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't have the note with me, so I apologize for that. So we went over some of that. The damage can cause uncoordinated movements, muscle spasms, walking, balance problems, speech problems, swallowing problems, and involuntary eye movements. See, the brain just has its fingers in so many pots. It's so many areas can help control and manage other areas. And then we're going to go on to the deeper structures. I'm not going to get terribly deep into these because we do have a time frame for me to finish, but we will quickly talk about the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the brainstem, the pineal gland, pituitary gland, and the amygdala, which and I think I added all of this later, so I don't have all the notes on it. Anyway, those are actually deep in the brain. I don't know if I had a picture of that. I don't think so. Not on this one. Okay. Okay, well, yeah, here's the picture. So you can see how deep these are. In the hypothalamus, it's like right kind of even with your ear there. The amygdala is right here, pituitary, and then the hippocampus are all real deep. None of them are very big. They're all pretty small, but they all have pretty big roles in what they do. The hypothalamus regulates, and you can read it, the body temperature. It synchronizes sleep patterns, manages hunger and thirst, and plays a role in some aspects of memory and emotion. The hippocampus is located under each temporal lobe. So there's two of them, and it supports, memory and learning, navigation. It receives information from the cerebral cortex, and it may be involved in Alzheimer's. The brainstem is essential for life. We cannot live without the brainstem. It actually manages our heart rate and rhythm, just about everything, and a little bit in every part of our brain. I didn't actually remember that it's instrumental in our reflexive actions, with sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing, those types of things. I thought that was, it wasn't new to me, but I hadn't remembered that.
So your brain causes a heart attack?
Well, what it can do is it can cause problems with it. Sure, if it's out of whack. I don't know that it would, it depends on defining a heart attack. If it makes your heart stop, it just wouldn't be due to cardiac disease, right? So yeah, you would, because you would die if the brainstem is injured. Badly enough anyway. So yeah.
Well, if the brain doesn't get enough oxygen
Mhm.
to our arterial,
Uh-huh.
thing, then we are in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. You'll have brain damage, and then you'll have other symptoms because of that. Sure.
That's why the brain is the one that should be taken into account in case of emergency. It has to be done right away.
Well, and there's a lot of different things in our body that monitor our O2, our oxygen levels, and our CO2 levels. So our brain works with that as well. And that's one of the reasons that, they'll put oxygen on you, or they'll put you on a high flow oxygen or a ventilator if needed, to make sure that your body's getting the oxygen. Now, if different parts of your brain are damaged, you still may have trouble, but our body is just, it's set with places around our little sensors in our body that also help with this. So, but the body, the mind, the brain reads it, not the mind, but the brain reads it. Yeah.
The brain can affect a heart attack is that when you go into fight or flight, when you're scared or when there's a
Right.
threat, your blood vessels they constrict. So that means a blood clot is more likely to get caught. There's like a wide blood vessel, it's not gonna get caught, just floating around in your blood system. All of a sudden you're stressed, you're worried about a lot of stuff, your blood vessels constrict, means they can get blocked. that can cause a heart attack.
Ivan is mentioning about the fight or flight response that can vasoconstrict, and it can make it hard for blood to get through, and it slows the circulation because of that, and it can cause a blood clot. So you could lose blood circulation to the heart.
The non-presence of blood circulation in the brain, I don't know if I can say that within a certain amount of time
Mhm.
will cause brain damage.
Yeah, you have about 4 minutes.
Okay,
And a lot of that depends on too, if you're like underwater in a cold environment, that usually will preserve it because it'll lower the body's oxygen requirements, slows the metabolism of it all. So keeping people cold is one thing that they do during codes, is cooling people down to help preserve the brain function and lower the metabolism. But yeah, you otherwise have about 4 minutes.
Yeah, you
so-
get that time.
So we have the pineal gland at the back of that corpus callosum that holds our hemispheres our hemispheres together, that releases melatonin for sleep. And you have the pituitary gland, that's a pea-sized structure that governs the function of other glands by regulating the flow of hormones to like the adrenals and ovaries and thyroid, the testicles. And it receives chemical signals from the hypothalamus, from the stalk in the blood supply. I think the pituitary gland is also called the master gland, because it controls a lot of that stuff. And the amygdala is just an almond shape, shaped structure. There's 2 of them, one behind each of the hemispheres, that is part of the limbic system, which regulates emotion and a little bit of memory. That also helps with our fight or flight response. Now let's see. Now I have notes for this one, I think. And I changed the way they go. So this slide will kind of make you crazy. Actually, what I want you to only focus on are where the red circles are, because we're going to talk about the ventricles of the brain. And I probably should have brought that, done this one after I did the meninges. So you have these blue structures in here. Those are areas that circulate cerebrospinal fluid. There's 4 on each side, 3, well, there's 4 of them together. You have the lateral ventricle on each side, which I believe is the 1 and 2, because then you have the 3rd ventricle here, and 4th ventricle here. So the cerebral spinal fluid circulates in there as well as the meninges, and then it goes down into the spinal column as well. It provides more cushion. It can take waste away also. They should not have blood in them. You know, blood in the spinal fluid or in the ventricles is a bad thing. But if you have a brain injury, you can have bleeding in the ventricles. And then they often will put a catheter in there to drain it. Or if you have an infection in there, they drain pus or whatever happens to be there. In some injuries, the brain wants to hold on to a lot of the water, so it's keeps more than it needs, and it creates pressure and can cause brain damage. So they'll drain that also, generally with a little hole that they put in there and a tube that will drain it. So here's what to know on the ventricles.
When it washes, when it cleans the brain, where does the waste go? How does it get into the blood to get carried away?
You know, I honestly don't know the answer to that, John. I should know that, and I was going to look that up and then I didn't. So,
If Rob knows the answer to that.
Rob does?
I don't know.
Oh,
We'll have to ask him.
yeah, he's gonna talk on this too.
How close to your liver, probably, John.
Ooh, that's a connection.
Could be tears, sorry.
It said it can only be removed from the brain by parenchyma, which is our cells. Let's see. Let's see. Collects proteins and other debris, carries it to the lymphatic ducts. And there is lymphatic ducts in your brain too, which I forgot to mention.
And what are
Um,
they?
Those are, lymphatics are part of the immune system. You have them all over actually, yeah, and they are like little blood vessels, but they aren't pumped. They're actually, lymph is moved through your body by movement, which is why one of the reasons we want people to move.
It's very important.
It sure is. It sure is.
Question.
Okay,
Go ahead.
No, I don't. So I do Qigong.
okay.
I really like that. And, it's a lot of tapping, like, and I don't even, especially your head, they tap your head.
Mm-hmm.
all over there, they knock on it, what is the reasoning for that?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know anything about that. What's that?
To line your chi, I don't know what it.
Is that Shiga? Is that what you called it?
Qigong.
Oh, Qigong, okay. You know what? It's probably, what I know about that is it helps to remove blockages. You have your meridians that run, and the idea with Qigong, I think, is to help remove those so that the body can heal itself. Maybe that does it. I don't know.
They do a lot of tapping, and then they do like where they run fingers through your head and.
Well, we have pressure points all over our body for various, functions too, that they say help. So maybe that's part of it.
I do like it.
Oh, yeah. Ask your instructor. That'd be great to know. Well, that's true too. YouTube you and everything on the internet's correct, right? Yeah.
No, everything
They
else-
can't lie on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go through circulation, and we're just going to be really brief on this, the major circulation of the brain. So you have your aortic arch, you have your aortas that go up here, and then your different arteries that go down. But the vertebral artery, and that goes up just up into the brain, and you see all that here. The vertebral artery and the middle cerebral artery are probably the main ones in the brain, and they do branch off and feed the rest of it. What I did find was the middle cerebral artery is the main one if you're going to have a stroke, and I think there's one on both sides here, is the main one, and primarily because and I wouldn't think so, because I believe it's the biggest artery, and usually that has more blood flow, and you're not really going to have as much problem where there's good blood flow. But it says that's the most common. And when I looked up why, I never found out why. I went to several different sites, and they just kept saying over and over that the middle cerebral artery is the main artery where strokes occur. And they said it is straighter than the others too, which, again, one that's really windy and tortuous, you would think would slow circulation down. So I'm not really sure why that is. Ischemic strokes are more common than hemorrhagic strokes. Ischemic meaning it doesn't get the blood that it needs. So blood clots basically are the most common reason you would have a stroke in the brain. About 13% are hemorrhagic strokes, or where you bleed. Those also are the worst, the bleeding strokes, because they bleed and they damage other parts of the brain if they're not able to get in there and stop the bleeding. It can occur inside the brain or outside the brain in the meninges, which already talked about that. Let's see. Yeah. So anyway, that's very basic, but we're doing pretty well on time. I'll be done in a few minutes. Any questions on the circulation of the brain? You have this aortic arch here, and I had a picture of it, but I don't have it here. The arteries that feed are like the carotid arteries and the vertebral, and they go right up, which all of you have probably had carotid ultrasounds looking for plaque in your arteries in the carotids, because that's generally where it comes from. If there's a problem with that, if it breaks off, it'll go right up and right up into the brain, which I guess that makes sense why the middle cerebral artery would do that. And it would cause slowing of the circulation, which could create a blood clot. So that makes sense to me. The vertebral artery doesn't have as many. They don't really know why, but it, for whatever reason, doesn't. And the neurons and neuroglial cells are the main cells in the brain. There's a bunch of different cells, but the main ones are the neurons, which you see right here. Has a body. They have the axon is underneath this yellow part here. And then the blue is the myelin sheath around it. There are a lot of non-neuron cells up there that really help our brain a lot. And the main one is astrocytes, and it's because it looks like a star, basically. To somebody it did anyway. So this is an astrocyte, and of the glial cells, that's the most abundant one. And so you have your neuron cells. Your dendrites are the ones that house the synapses, and all your neurotransmitters are kind of in there, and they kind of bounce around and do their thing. Okay, so those are the main ones, the neurons, and then the astrocytes. And those are in all over your brain, and they're like in your spinal cord. They say that there's anywhere from 85 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. I think in spinal cord too. 85 to 100. And then in terms of the glial cells, which astrocytes are one kind of it, but as far as glial cells, there's about 85 billion of those as well. And they're finding through current research that they help a lot in connecting messages to and from and things like that. They all carry and receive messages. And though they differ in size and shape, in terms of these guys, they all have the same makeup. They all have the nucleus here, and then the cell body, and then the dendrites and all of that. So here you go. This is what your neurons do. They carry messages to and from. And I already talked about they use electrical signals that can create chemical signals to transmit the messages. They're really responsible for everything that we do. If they don't work, we don't. And then the glial cells are, again, non-neuron cells that assist in a lot of a variety of actions and what's the word I'm looking for? Things that we do in our bodies. Functions, that's the word. And then I'm going to quickly just go over to the cranial nerves. I'm not going to talk about them. Very little here. So you have 12 cranial nerves. The first two are located up in the brain, actually, and go down your spinal cord. The other 10 are actually in your spinal cord, your brainstem, and going down your back. And they help with everything else. And see what I mean? The integration of the brain and all the areas is just phenomenal. And our brain has the ability to relearn, to access other parts of the brain, to assist in the function of what the damaged portion did. Cranial nerves are, well, they're sensitive if you break your back, but they're pretty hardy, and they are protected by the spinal cord and the meninges. And then I didn't put neurotransmitters in here, but I think that most of you have heard about the neurotransmitters. Let me go back here. Like dopamine, acetylcholine, GABA, which is a huge long word, gamma amino butyric acid, glutamate, histamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin. Those are the main neurotransmitters that do the majority of the work. The axon terminal is where those things kind of live, and they get the chemical signals or electrical signals to make things go, and that's what happens. And the messages are sent. Some neurotransmitters excite the other neurons and make things happen, like muscle contraction, that kind of thing. Some of them are inhibitory, that kind of keep things from happening. Did you have something to say? Oh, okay. I was going to say, help me out. When the neurotransmitters are done doing their actual job in sending a message or giving a message away, sometimes they just fade away. They just kind of go away. Some are reabsorbed and some are broken down and eliminated. If your neurotransmitters aren't working very well or not working the way they should, you can have depression, fibromyalgia, asthma, muscular sclerosis, memory and sleep problems, heart rate issues, breathing issues, blood pressure, diabetes, all kinds of things. And again, see the integration here, because we talked about all of those other things with other parts of the brain.
That's what I heard one time, when I was listening
Mm-hmm.
on the radio. Brain specialist was saying that at the end of the day, the brain tries to connect with our different organs.
Mm-hmm.
And if that organ is not functioning well, the brain gets a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
complicated.
It's very
And
complicated.
Because of that, if you have a liver problem or a kidney problem, then the brain can just put it back, and there you go. You have that kind of disease.
You what?
You have that kind of disease. The brain, cannot, because the brain has to ask them, how are you doing?
Right.
If they are not doing right, then the brain has to give some kind of,
Right. Help.
I mean,
Brain gives
to the body.
Right.
And then that
Sure.
you have something wrong with your kidney or your, your too much sugar or anything.
Right.
So that's the way they are.
Yeah. Well, I'm
So-
sure the brain sends signals and does the best it can to help function. But then we're given, we do blood work, we do scans and things like that to help us figure out what else is going on. Right.
Yeah,
And then
I-
we work on it that direction.
Yeah.
Anybody know what goes through a potato's brain, Linda? Okay. That's it. I mean, it was really an overview, and it
Can't do it all.
it's a lot. It's a lot. I talked a lot longer than I was kind of hoping to, but it's a lot to even absorb.
We start talking about dementia, well,
right? Yeah, yeah.
The brain, they say, is the mysterious part of the body. Nobody
It
understands.
is. They don't. In the research that I was doing, there's so much that they're doing and there's so much that's not well understood.
Yeah.
Anybody have questions at home? No? Is there a question in the chat? Go ahead. Hi.
Hi, Terry. I just wanted to thank you for selfish reasons. It's, your presentation today is really relevant to one of my neurological condition, which was caused by a lipoma at the base of the brain and the top of the spinal column. Unfortunately, it was there from birth and wasn't discovered until I was 55, and then it was almost too late because of the amount of the compression on the spinal cord, and it was preventing the fluid that you mentioned from providing the necessary cushioning and so forth. So it was removed. 5% of it is still within the brainstem area, and it's not malignant or anything, and it's just there. Yeah, it's gonna be there. But all of this, I've never completely understood how everything happens, and where my symptoms, which are a little bit similar to MS, or it was thought to be very, very mild cerebral palsy for most of my life. But all of this is really helpful. And I think it's also relevant to a lot of other people. So I'll be sharing, I mean, if it's okay, your recordings. And I just can't emphasize how you took things that are very difficult for the average person to understand, and you made it understandable. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope it was helpful.
Very.
It's a lot of information, and I know when you go too long, people start getting bored and their brains wander because we get bored easily, right? So whatever, it is what it is. And so, well, I hope that, what kind of treatment are you, I mean, is there a good prognosis for you?
Well, it was removed in 2004, and I was still working. So, but I was at the point of considering early retirement or whatever, which I did. And then I did a lot of neuro rehab. I had to find somebody that understood that. And I would go 3 days a week, 3 hours a day, and for years, and did that. You know, initially everything is very fluid. And so for the first time I had perfect balance and perfect everything, relatively speaking, but that doesn't, they warn me that it starts rigidifying or whatever within so many months. And I'd say now, because I'm 75, it's no, my body has just taken a lot of stress over the years. So tendinitis and things, and arthritis and things like that complicate it now. But yeah, and there's I've had Botox, I've had all different types of therapy over the time, but I really have been able to maintain a pretty normal lifestyle. So.
Oh, good. Well, it sounds like your rehab was like trying to retrain other parts of the brain to take over. Okay. That's what I was thinking. That's a and account.
And really build on the neuroplasticity of the body. And I saw people at that particular center who had plateaued after strokes like 12 years before and so forth. And this guy who is Polish and followed a slightly different regimen could accomplish things with them. It was just amazing.
I think they don't understand a whole lot, because you've seen where doctors have said this will never happen, or and then sure enough, you do exactly the opposite. So they don't understand, and maybe the person's soul plays a part in all of that, and their tenacity and all of that too. But well, I wish you really the very best.
Thank you. Thank you. It's
So,
great help what everybody's doing here. So
and
thank you.
the next talk, I think, is Rob, And he's gonna be talking, game brains that are designed by the students, so you guys will have to attend that one too.
And actually, Dr. Buka Putnam is coming on Thursday too, to she'll talk about brains. She's very interested in protecting the brains.
Yeah,
And at the end of the month, we have 2 student nurses that are talking about stroke prevention. So.
oh, there you go,
so the brains
preventative.
are
Perfect.
basically,
Well, thanks, everybody.
and
Thanks
that's
for
what they're reporting.